came around a little after you did. But yeah, I remember the first big project I worked on as a grad student in the early 2000s was looking at gender dynamics for HIV prevention in South Africa,
Yeah.
right? And so NIH was funding that work. And I had a Fulbright to Nepal working with sex workers, sexual empowerment of Nepali women, right? So Fulbright also being a form of diplomacy.
Mhm.
And then I come out of grad school, and with the Bush administration, so many of my senior colleagues were losing funding just because of the topics that they were working on. So, as a junior investigator, I was learning right away how to make that pivot or
Yep.
how to get the money, right? But still collect the data that you intended
Yes.
to and publish using the
Yes.
terminology that you do,
Y-
that you want to, right?
Yes.
I see a lot of my colleagues who are just starting in their careers now uncomfortable with that. And I recognize that discomfort, that cognitive dissonance. But yeah, when you're talking about particularly federal funding, a lot of it is playing the game to get the funds. um, and then deciding, what do you include additional data in that? So what a lot has been happening over the past month, but given you have seen the ups and downs of federal funding, you've seen foundation funding, what do you see this current storm and chaos as being part of part of the process, typical, or is it really, I feel we've been using this term so much, but is it really unprecedented times in terms of funding for gender work?
You know, I think what's unprecedented to me, and I've been talking to my colleagues. I have some wonderful colleagues, and like shout out to like some of the pioneers in the field that I've got. But Hortensia Morrow was somebody I got to work with very early in my career, and I've stayed very close to, and we kind of talked it through. And what feels unprecedented to me is the deconstruction of institutions rather than the shift of institutions. That
Mhm.
that feels unprecedented. Um, the issue of language, the targeting of certain groups, the feeling for many of us who are social science and public health researchers that there is a dehumanization of populations that we are focused on because we have recognized that that dehumanization was already occurring and it was compromising health and health at scale, right? Um, for there to be some elements that we feel that there is some state sanctioned dehumanizing, that I think has happened. Bluntly, I think that's happened before. I think we have felt those things before. And
Mm.
I want to say, in these very politicized times, um, I think, you know, there have been ways, in my opinion, that I have felt that there's been I mean, people may not love me saying this, but I feel like there's been some dehumanization of certain regions of the country or certain populations, rural white men in certain ways,
Right.
like some of the extent, I've been really struck in some ways with for many of us who do the work globally, particularly with work with men, sort of the considerations, thoughtfulness, humanization, respect that we would engage with populations outside the US who might be rural men who are economically disenfranchised, who come from traditional cultures where they feel that systematically their power is being stripped from them. I think that there is more thought to what that means and the language we use sometimes then I feel like I see it here. And coming, it was
Mhm.
probably one of the reasons I wanted to come back to Louisiana. And I think as a field, we do need to reflect on some of that. I also think that I think it's important to know that um, when you when you pivot to align with an administration where there are aspects of that administration you don't agree with, and you seek funding, that does not mean you have to seek funding for things you don't agree with. It simply means seek funding for where there's alignment. And then
Right.
there's opportunity for you to build in some other evidence base to support those elements that you feel like are getting lost because they're not funded mandates. Well, guess what? I know this is not going to shock anybody. A lot of us are doing our papers outside of our 40-hour week, and
Yeah.
so that's completely legal. That's completely legal. And that doesn't mean that we aren't meeting our federal mandate when we apply for those grants, get those funds to work on the issues that do align with where our federal government is today, that we contribute to the science in that area and fulfill our roles and obligations. But once data exists, no matter where that data come from, we have a right to work on those pieces the way we want. So
As
I,
academics. Yeah, I think
as
some,
academics,
yeah.
absolutely. And so I think that's one of the things, that I encourage people to consider is that there are means of survival where you don't feel like you have to compromise. Um, Also, I think we're all looking to see how foundations and where foundations step up to where things are lost, and to look out for that, and that we are just going to have to be patient and frankly generous with our free time to the best of our ability. And I know that that's not what people want to hear, but generous with our free time to the best of our ability to do the work that we want to do that's just simply not going to be funded right now.
Yeah.
I see a question on the board, so I'll leave it to you to moderate those.
Yeah. Whoa. Thank you. For the question. Keep them coming. We'll hold those for the Q&A session. Um, yeah, I've had many of my mentors, including several very successful NIH funded men,
Yeah,
talk about the fact that you find ways to collect the data for those underrepresented populations or underserved populations, um, so that later you can make the case for that funding, even if it's not happening now, right? And so some of it does require being creative, in how you go about getting the information you're seeking within the scope of what is fundable at the time. And so, yeah, you make a great point that, certainly academics can find ways to still speak truth about, health disparities or inequities.
right.
I think some of our colleagues at institutions such as USAID or, that are being funded, by these US institutions in other countries might have less freedom to do that. But I see my job as an academic educator and researcher is to give voice to those who don't feel like they can speak to those things. And I think it's especially important in times like these.
And Michelle, we're a private institution. So
Yes.
there are some state-funded institutions in certain states that their hands are tied on certain things, and so I do know for some of them they feel comfortable being able to write outside of their work hours in these areas, and some don't. And I think just understanding that people have to do what they have to do to survive difficult times and not cast stones, because for some of
Right.
it I am at a private school, and that does
Yeah.
give me a little more latitude than I might be able to have, and I have to recognize that.
Sure. Sure. So, what do you see as the most immediate implications of the halt in federal funding that we've seen for gender related programming and research?
Can we take a step back even from funding,
Hmm.
um, in defense of women? I think the thing that I think that we working in the gender space are going to be contending with is gender is now is a watchword.
Yeah.
Gender identity is a watchword. Women, we didn't, but you got to use it. Why can't we use it? And to do so under the argument in defense of women, and that is really, I think that's really hard because it negates, I think, the scientific positioning. Let me restate. not positioning, the scientific evidence today, that we understand that there is sex and there is identity, and those things do not necessarily match, although they may. And that you can believe whatever you want to believe. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm simply sharing with you the data that speaks to the fact that people who identify in this way may suffer in ways that are related to discriminatory actions that are being taken at an individual community level, but also at a state level. And that there are certain means of protection that may be denied in the process. And I think that's sort of where I am absolutely worried about funding, but I'm actually like, how do we collectively describe this in a way, collectively, so that we can pursue things where there is alignment across us? Because sometimes the divides among us really constrain our ability to collectively act. And I don't want to force collective action. It has to come where we have agreement. But I do feel that the field at this point has a sense of agreement that there is sex and there is identity, and that we want to understand both in terms of risk protection and policy solutions. And so if we can come to agreement on that, then at least we can be consistent in the way that we write things.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I put this on, so dumb maybe, but I put it on Blue Sky. But I was like, if we all use, what if we just all decide? I mean, there's a bunch of words that NSF says we can't use that are so like included. Oh my God, how do
Right.
if we just consistently use a lot of the same words, like, I'm sorry, but there's the inclusive and exclusive criteria in any study. If we all consistently, as a group of scientists, say these are simply words we use to describe populations, and this is the standard of the field, and we just all consistently use them, it may slow down the review process, but at least we're in it together. And so if
Mhm.
you don't want to save money, which apparently, that's the goal here, then saving money is to think about what is a more expeditious way than making benign words something to flag.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing that has given me a little bit of comfort is, when I think about the lack of attention to science and evidence and sex and gender, I remind myself, while that feels personal, given the work that I do, it's happening in so many other areas as well. I mean, look
Yeah.
at, vaccines,
Yep.
um, or, gun violence prevention. I mean, just the misinformation and the
Yeah.
dismissal of scientific evidence.
And the measles
Global.
outbreak, a
Oh,
measles
sure.
outbreak. We have a
Yeah.
measles outbreak. The measles outbreak is in Texas. The Louisiana government recently asked the Department of Public Health, or stopped the Department of Public Health from doing vaccine promotion activities, vaccine education. And at the same time that we're getting a measles outbreak, really struggle. I'm really struggling because I do think there can be some common ground here.
Mhm.
That we are the division and the politicization of some things that are like, okay, but think we can agree on some things like polio, you know?
Right. Right. And so what you said about, I forget which phrase you used, but to have that collective action, if we extend it beyond gender scholars or gender programming folks and think about, what are the themes throughout all of these actions that we can bring in people from other sectors and fields as well. Yeah, they're strength in numbers, as they say. So more long-term implications. How do you see funding restrictions and the tone around sex and gender right now affecting gender-based health disparities?
Oh goodness. So we know that uh in 2016 we saw a rise in certain kinds of hate crimes. We know this, right? And so uh I'm deeply, deeply concerned about a rise in hate crimes again. But I've got to say, particularly for trans people, that is probably like, yes, I am worried about all aspects of gender, but the anti-trans stuff that is happening right now, it petrifies me because I think that this is complex, right? Like I see a lot of my friends of my generation who have kids who are identifying, and it's a complex decision. Do you want to, you we were nervous about my baby was born and I was running a fever and we needed to put an antibiotic in her. And we were like, oh my God, should we give her an antibiotic? We did, overeducated parents, of course you take
Right.
a step, right? So of course, like it's a really complex decision to decide what you want to do in terms of, hormones, et cetera, or blockers with your child. And that's why, it is such an important thing that parents, children, and providers are able to make those decisions together, and that science is continuing to develop. And yes, we're going to see some, things that we learned that are not quite what we thought they were. And that's what science is. Um, and the pushback because we don't fully understand it, and therefore you are seeing some tensions there. The way that is compromising the mental health and safety of trans youth in particular, or non-binary, gender non-conforming, queer broadly, I'm really worried about. It, I think many of us now have personal stories with that because also with the open mind, kids who are naturally exploring what is my identity in all these different ways, they're getting the space to do that. So of course they're exploring that. That's just part of what you do. And now maybe they're voicing it more. And I don't know. I'm just really worried because like those things happening at the same time are just colliding in a very worrisome way.
Yeah. Yeah. I I feel you on that, particularly the mental health of those young people and their families
And their
that are
families, yeah,
supportive. Yeah.
yeah.
So you've done some international work. Do you see, or what do you see as the long-term implications of what the US is doing
Okay,
for
I
health
have this one.
disparities globally?
Okay, I have this one because somebody just had this conversation with me. I'm not going to mention the country that we're talking about, but when there are efforts for nations to support political agendas that are not necessarily science aligned, or and when they are not, um, when they are populist movements that are created with some frustration with elite populations, and guess what we are, and there's some legit reasons for that. um there's sort of a systematic, and we can call it, some may use the term authoritarianism, but we can call it whatever you want, but there's some patterns at play. One of the first patterns is get to the press, because that controls the narrative. I think we are deeply in that's been going on for some time. And the next is to hit the institution. And I think that's where I think no matter what happens from here, I think the IDC, I just have to hope the IDCs get sustained for the NIH, because for many states, including Mississippi, the top employer in Mississippi is the University of Mississippi Medical Center. The top employers in Louisiana are Ochsner and Tulane. Okay, these are groups that rely on this federal funding. Our biomedical research creates not just jobs writ large in these states, but it also creates a more economically and educationally diverse population. It helps sustain our universities so that people can stay within the state to get their higher education if they choose. And it advances the kids in our state to support them to be able to be across the nation and help eliminate some of, frankly, what I feel like is geographic biases against the Deep South. I'm a Mississippi born kid, so I got some bias there. I got some protective instincts there. So I have to hope that that's okay. But I do think that we're going to be seeing the NIH cuts regardless, even if we get to sustain the existential, effectively fight against the existential threat that the IDC cuts for NIH are. I just cannot see how any state is going to be able to allow that to happen without decimating the employment workforce in their state. But we're going to need philanthropy. We're going to need philanthropy so badly. And I think this is a time where we as scientists need to be aligned, but we also need those of us who are connected with foundations. We really, I know that myself, I'm talking and I'm saying, you all are going to get a lot more applications. You all, like, I'm happy to recuse myself. I am a very fortunate person because I have a hard money position at this time. I am happy to recuse myself from submitting anything and support you as in an advisory role to let you know where we're seeing the cuts the most. We at Newcomb Institute, we're a gender equity focused institute that built out of the former Newcomb College, which was the women's college. So we have an underlying endowment. I am happy to let you know that we are actively thinking about how we are going to use some of that money to help support some of the people who got some of the losses in funding, stop work orders, for example, from USAIDs. We're thinking about that now. We have to step up and we have to get our philanthropy partners to step up. And we have to get them to know where the losses are because they're not necessarily going to know. So I think those of us who are in senior positions need to do that. We also need to be reaching out to the junior faculty and our doctoral students to let them know, like, you have got to keep yourself safe. That is your job. Your job is to keep yourself safe. We want you to be part of the fight, but think carefully and we will respect your decision about how you do it, and tell us what you're thinking. I'm not going to promise I can be the voice in all places, but I'm listening and I'm hearing. And Michelle, I know you're in that position. I see Michelle Decker on this call. I think there's a lot of people on this call who are out of position that have a certain level of security with their position that they can be those voices. Because I really worry about those junior faculty right now.
Mhm.
I don't know if I
Well,
answered your question.
well, let me ask you one thing, and then I want to go back to a part of that. One thing I'm hearing from philanthropy, however, is that if they fill in the gaps, then that gives the signal to the US government that it can be the private sector and philanthropy that funds these things, and the US government doesn't need to. And so the vibe I'm getting from philanthropic, a couple of the big philanthropic
Yeah.
organizations is that we're gonna we're gonna hold where we are
Yeah.
until things settle
Until we
down
know.
because we don't want to jump in right away and then set this precedent that, yeah, getting rid of USAID and cutting down NIH is okay because, these philanthropists will fill in.
So I hear that. I hear that. But when COVID happened, they stepped up.
Yeah.
This is crisis. We are going to lose our infrastructures and workforce if we don't get some help. And I would say first and foremost, and I don't know who's on the call, and I hope I'm not, but I think the first and foremost, this is just my bias. It's what's happening in global development, global aid, and it's happening in DEI or EDI, whatever you choose to call it, into those efforts, and it's what's happening for trans communities. Those are the ones that I personally, I mean, please put in the chat if there's ones I'm not thinking of, but those are the three that I'm seeing got hit really hard, really fast. And if we do not support those people to survive, the infrastructure's gone. And so you can wait, but you won't have anything to build off of.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a tricky situation.
And repro
So
rights.
going back,
And repro rights, please repro rights.
yeah, yeah. Well, going back to the long-term implications. So you talked a little bit about institutions in the US and the workforce. What about funding for health programs through development agencies like USAID? What what impact do you see that having, particularly for women or gender diverse communities, if programs just suddenly go away?
you know, Death. I mean, I don't mean to be flippant about it, but I don't. I think we're all saying the same thing. Who are we if we crush humanitarianism? Who are we if we crush public health? Who are we if we crush education? Who are we? And I mean,
You
I don't.
were so you were coming of age in your research career during a lot of HIV funding. So I've thought about that in particular, some of the mathematical modeling that they're doing already if a lot of the PEPFAR programs go away. And the impact that a lot of programs have had on saving women's lives, preventing the transmission to babies, saving gender diverse people, everybody in some communities from HIV. So I see that as one example that it'll all come back, I think.
Yeah, but yes, and is it going to get tracked?
Right.
So this is my big fear. So we know that within about a year of the Dobbs decision, we saw the increase in infant mortality. Why would we
Yeah.
think this is going to be any different? I could only see it being worse because it's hitting a ton of issues all at once.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's the cruelty. That's what everyone keeps saying. It's the cruelty. I don't know what to do if leadership doesn't care about the cruelty, if leadership doesn't care about the death. I don't know how to construct arguments because we can give the data and tell you people will die. But if you don't care, what are we going to do? And so I guess
Yeah.
that's what I'm like. If things continue to go in this direction and philanthropy doesn't step up to sustain these infrastructures and infrastructures to track. So you and I are both deeply invested in the data, right? Because
Mhm.
um, we need both. And I understand that programs must come before data, but we need the data too, because we need to track what's happening and what's not happening and what is, you know, who's dying first.
Yeah. Yeah. And at what rates? The Gender Equity Unit, as I said, is primarily funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the Data for Health Initiative seeks to do just that, to provide the data to make the case for changes in policies and programs, and to highlight, where inequities exist, primarily gender equity. So the more we have, complete and accurate data, the more we can show the impact of these programs. And some of my colleagues at Hopkins have been doing that with reproductive rights, looking at
Yeah.
infant and women's mortality, maternal mortality as a result of changes in state laws around reproductive rights and abortion. And yeah, the more we can collect data showing the negative impact and voice that, through media or advocacy or civil society,
Mhm,
um, the
mhm,
more we can keep
exactly.
these issues at top of mind.
Absolutely. And we've been seeing it happen with abortion here in the Deep South,
Mhm.
We at Newcomb Institute just got a $3 million gift to work on sexual reproductive health and rights here in the Gulf South.
Wow.
We've been able to institute a survey here in Louisiana that we're going to be spreading to Mississippi and Texas that focuses on gender-based violence. And at a time when we know that CDC may not be able to sustain NSVIS, and we don't know when the new data from NSVIS may be coming out, um, I think it's organizations like ours, institutions like ours that have some access to funding. We need to be stepping up. And that is where, in a sense, like we're not true philanthropists, but we have access and are able to do it. But we wouldn't like, we're filling those gaps because we are not confident that our government will, which
Yeah.
again is like, I just hope philanthropists are listening and hear this. You can't hold, you can't
Yeah.
stop. It's getting cut off. It's like it's getting cut off and people are leaving because they don't know if they're going to have a job tomorrow and they have to take care of their families, you know? This is not a time to wait and see. We have to act now. And you need to help, please, if you are a funder, please help sustain the infrastructure, the workforce, the trainees, or we will not, it's not just we will not have it now, we will not have it in 20 years.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think your point about forming coalitions almost between
Yes.
academic researchers, civil society, the communities that are being affected to continue to tell the stories of how things are being negatively impacted by policies. So the chat has been um, active. So let me ask a couple of questions that came in from the audience. Um, so Jill was asking about universities that are caving into what Trump wants, or going along with these executive orders and policies. And Jill specifically mentions Columbia. What is your reaction there? You talked about you and I coming from private institutions, so there is variance in how much institutions can
What we can do.
respond, but what are your thoughts on that?
I'm officially an administrator now, right? So I have to think about what I have to say, but I also have a very different perspective than I had when I was faculty and not at the administrative level. There is a complexity in how administrators make decisions that is so much farther beyond than what I understood. You know, in my mind, I was like, it's what's right. But it turns out at the very highest levels, it's a lot more political than you'd realize. I'm gonna give you an example of someone I've been watching here in Louisiana who I'm a bit captivated by. We have a senator in Louisiana who is a physician who clearly is struggling with some of the, well, let's just take the RFK junior appointee, and is in a position where a this is someone who's been in the incumbent, been in a position for a long time. In a different time, this would just be a no-brainer. He would, but now people the party helps bring people forward to run against him.
Hmm.
And he's caught between a rock and a hard place. Where do I need to draw the line? Do I want to survive? Because if I survive, I can get back in there and make some dents around some of these concerns that I have about vaccines. It's very clear to me he is a proponent of vaccines and is very concerned that there are people in leadership in politics that are not, and I believe wants to be that voice. Do I stand firm on all of my convictions and give up, or do I give in on these and live to fight another day? And I
Mhm.
think that our administrators, our presidents, et cetera, are in that same boat. And I'm not saying people are making the right decisions or the wrong. I'm not saying that, but I think it's a lot harder than I had realized. Also, quite frankly, we have never had so many women and women of color in leadership positions of presidencies at major universities. And I do not believe there has ever been a point in our history where there has been the bringing of university presidents in the ways that we have seen.
Yeah,
And I cannot help but be struck by that.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
so yes, call it out, but also be careful not to undermine some of the institutions that remain, that can speak of the science that continues to exist. And again, I don't know where that line is. Everybody has to decide for themselves, but we are in a very hard political time.
yeah. Yeah, and going back to something you said earlier, we don't know all the details of what's going on behind the scenes, at an institution or with an individual that we think is not speaking up as much as they should.
And we really don't sometimes, right?
Yeah, and so
Sometimes
as you said,
backdoor, you know,
yeah,
yeah. I think people would be surprised to learn how much at the helm of universities there is interaction with political systems, because there's so much about where you put things in a city, what
mhm,
they're able to do. There are certain deals that get cut that you want, where some private universities are able to ensure certain types of care that may not otherwise be available in that state, but which is left alone. So I mean, there's a lot of complexity there.
yeah, yeah.
It's a hard job. I don't want it, at least not at this time.
I know I've been saying I don't envy our department chairs or deans or anyone
President.
in
I mean,
those
I don't envy the
positions right now.
president at this time. It is so hard. And I'm sorry my thing keeps falling out.
You're fine. All
And I know
right.
I'm being so like I'm sounding so conservative. I used to be a rabble rouser and I'm such an administrator now.
No, but I think there's like your ideals, values, right? And then there's the reality of what actually can be achieved. And so like where do you find the comfortable middle ground of that where you're protecting yourself, your family, your own peace, and you are the rebel rouser, right? And
Yes.
yeah, as people move up the ranks, it gets more complicated, as our lives change, and we have other people that are dependent on us, it becomes more complicated. And so yeah, we, as you said before, we can't throw stones. We just have to, continue to all be in this together, even if we don't completely agree with the person who is speaking for us.
Yeah.
All right. I have another question from Shrestha. I am attending this meeting from India. I'd like to know if changes in research regarding gender issues being cut short, will it change how other countries fund research on similar topics on gender and other social issues?
Oh my
So the
gosh.
US, big and powerful country, has a lot of influence. Do you think we'll see that in terms of funding shifts from other countries?
I was extremely frustrated to see some articles from India recently where it was described that USAID was influencing the NSF, the National Family Health Survey, the NFHS in India, which is our DHS, or I think of myself as Indian and American. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think the political ramifications will be felt everywhere, because we're already seeing sort of an undermining of credibility that is getting attached to the data where the timing of that discussion was really striking to me because it was right after our prime minister and our president met. And so um I mean, the other side of it is I think there's a good relationship between Modi and Trump, and that can be good. And yes, I think that these connections will definitely be affecting India. I can't say for all countries. I just feel like, and I have a feeling that the person who asked the question actually also had that answer and has it better than I do.
All right. And a question from Asta. How can we leverage local or continent level organizations to bring change? As a Tanzanian, I've been thinking about the role of Africa CDC and the African Union in bringing this data.
I'm really concerned about the CDC international work. I don't know the answer to those questions, but one thing that I'm excited about that I think is very different than if this would have happened 20 years ago, let's say. And I do want to credit, I don't know, the Pan Africa work is to me just beautiful and astounding, but like the radical increase in the number of researchers in country able to undertake the work so
Yeah.
that it can be sustained in a way that allows for the leadership to come from within. I think, you know, I mean, I'm always a believer when you have lemons, try to make lemonade. There may be greater opportunity for that. Um, and so let's see. And I think it's the onus is on all of us to support those researchers, and maybe for some of us who have had great publication experience in international journals, to be collaborating with some of those researchers to support them in the generation of the papers where they are in the leadership role. They are, but we're just here to like help contribute to the science and be able to be strong collaborators, and get to learn in the process, to get our students to learn in the process. So international collaborations continue. But yeah, I mean, I think you know the answer to that question. I don't know. Can we turn it back to that person? Because maybe I bet they have better ideas than I do.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, what was all the capacity strengthening efforts and sustainability efforts for, if not to build a generation of, data producers and researchers in country, right?
Yeah.
And so continued mentorship of them, especially during these tumultuous times, will be needed. But maybe this is an opportunity to sort of pass the baton to local institutions and researchers.
And for them to actually, for them to grab it. We don't
Yeah,
even
that's
solve.
right. Yeah. All right. We're almost at time. I want to ask one more question and hopefully end on a
Am I
positive
allowed to ask
note.
you? Am I allowed to ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Um, so it's very fun to do this. Super grateful that you invited me. Love also that we are in a time of solidarity across all of us, nationally and internationally, working together with centers and institutes focused on these issues. For you and your unit, what is the one, like, what is, how have you, what are you all doing to help fill the gaps? Knowing, yeah, because you're hearing, as we are, like philanthropists are holding, but we have some philanthropic support. And so I'm
Mm.
curious because I would like to learn. So what are you
What are we
doing?
doing to
What
fill
are
the
you doing
gaps?
right now, knowing that we're in a crisis point and others are getting things lost to them, but you are in a position where you have some sustained funding to continue the work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's both a blessing and a challenge to be in this position because it's painful to watch so many of my colleagues suddenly without jobs or without programs that they're passionate about. Um, so with our funding in particular, we do focus a lot on technical assistance and capacity building, particularly of um, government workers and academic researchers in low and middle income countries. So, as part of, even if we're doing research studies with them, we're trying to build capacities around, collecting the best quality data, the most complete data, publishing that data in different ways, not just academic papers, but how do you turn it into a research brief or a policy brief so that you can then take it to your governments to make the case for what needs to be addressed. Um, how we have a mentorship program, where we're going to be taking the mentees and turning them into mentors so that they can, mentors others from their home countries or within the region. So I think it's a long game for us, always thinking about how can we build the skill set, particularly locally, to sort of hand off, to the next generation. I think about that with my students, my junior staff, but our unit, it really takes that approach as well. Um, and yeah, weather the storm with the money. As I said before, sometimes you have to be creative about how you go about securing funds that are in line with what funders want, whether it's, national governments or philanthropists, and finding creative ways to get additional data that you think are needed, because sometimes even the philanthropists too, they don't know what's needed and you have to bring that evidence to them. So how can you we're always asking how can we collect the data and the evidence to make the case for what comes next? How can we build that into our projects? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, what
Okay.
I am hearing from you, and it's so funny because I didn't think about it, but I had this team meeting at this. I do not disagree about the who's interested in the evidence to the person who just
Yeah,
wrote that,
yeah,
but um, I had a meeting with our team, and this it's I basically said exactly what you said, which is stay the course,
yeah,
stay the course. We're doing the work. This is our job. We are in the ability to continue to do it. We are staying the course.
yeah. Yeah, and easier said than done. And I always appreciate leadership who talk about, their breaking points too. Somebody said to me the other day, "You seem very calm and collected about this whole thing." And I'm like, well, there's screaming going on behind closed doors and in my head, that it's not doesn't mean I'm not emotionally affected by this. But yeah, if we can stay the course and not let this um break down our morale and our commitment to this work, then ultimately we'll be okay. Anita, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you. I look forward to like these continuing conversations. And
Yes.
yeah, I'm so sad I can't join you in now. I'm all the sadder I can't join you in Turkey. But that's just I think the work you're doing is wonderful, and thank you for making sure that we can all continue to stay connected. That's helpful
Yeah.
at this time.
And for our audience, she references Turkey. There are going to be some leaders in gender equity and health data gathering in Istanbul late next month. And we're coming up with an action plan for the next 5 years. So there will be much more communication around that. Um, if anyone in the audience has not signed up for our newsletter or follows us on social media, please do so to hear about upcoming webinars as well as our work around the action plan that's forthcoming. Anita, thank you again, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Hang in there.
Well, thanks everybody. Bye bye.